They thought it was just a cheerful family portrait until they zoomed in on the youngest child. Daniel Harper had spent 15 years as a historian specializing in Boston's Gilded Age families, but he had never expected to find anything remarkable at the Pemberton estate sale. The massive Victorian mansion on Beacon Hill was being emptied after the last family member, Eleanor Pemberton, had died at 93 with no heirs. Antique dealers and curiosity seekers crowded the rooms, haggling over furniture, silver, and oil paintings. Daniel wandered through the third-floor bedrooms, away from the chaos below. These rooms had clearly been servants' quarters, small, simple, with narrow beds and plain furniture. In one corner room, he found a wooden trunk that had been overlooked by the more aggressive buyers. Inside were stacks of photographs, letters, and documents dating back to the 1890s. He carefully lifted out the photographs, each one a window into Boston's past. There were formal portraits of stern-faced ancestors, snapshots of garden parties, images of children in sailor suits and elaborate dresses. Then he found it, a large format photograph that stopped him cold. The image showed a prosperous family posed in an ornate parlor. The father sat in a carved wooden chair, prosperous and confident in an expensive suit. The mother stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, wearing an elaborate gown with leg of mutton sleeves. 3 children were arranged around them, 2 boys in matching velvet suits, perhaps 10 and 12 years old, and standing between them, a girl of about 8 in a beautiful white dress with ribbons. But it was the smallest figure that caught Daniel's attention. Seated on the floor at the mother's feet was another child, a girl who appeared to be 5 or 6 years old. Unlike the others, she wasn't looking at the camera. Her head was slightly bowed, her thin face partly shadowed. Even in the formal photograph, something seemed wrong. Daniel turned the photograph over. Written in faded ink, "The Worthington family, Christmas 1898. He knew the Worthington name. Charles Worthington had been a shipping magnate, one of Boston's wealthiest men. His mansion had been torn down in the 1920s to make way for an apartment building, but his business had shaped the city's economy for decades. Daniel purchased the entire trunk for $20, a bargain the dealer accepted eagerly, more interested in selling the expensive furniture downstairs. He carried it to his modest apartment in the South End, already planning how he would catalog and preserve these materials for the historical society where he worked. That evening, he spread the photographs across his dining table, organizing them chronologically. He kept returning to the Worthington family portrait, something nagging at his historian's instincts. The composition was typical for the era, the clothing appropriate for their class and the time period. Yet something felt profoundly wrong. He retrieved his magnifying glass, a tool he used regularly for examining old documents, and studied the photograph more carefully. That's when he saw it, the details that would change everything. Daniel's hand trembled slightly as he held the magnifying glass over the youngest child in the photograph. In the harsh light of his desk lamp, details invisible to the casual eye became startlingly clear. The girl's dress, which had seemed simply plain compared to her siblings' elaborate clothing, was actually threadbare. The fabric was worn thin at the shoulders and elbows, and there were visible patches poorly sewn along the hem. Her shoes, just visible beneath the dress, were cracked and ill-fitting, several sizes too large for her small feet. But it was her physical appearance that disturbed Daniel most. While the other 3 children had round, healthy faces with clear skin and bright eyes, this child's face was gaunt. Her cheeks were hollow, her eyes sunken. Her wrists, where they emerged from the 2 short sleeves, were painfully thin. Even her hair, pulled back severely from her face, lacked the lustrous quality of the other children's carefully styled curls. The contrast was shocking. The family had clearly spared no expense for this formal portrait. The photographer would have charged a substantial fee. The elaborate clothing of the parents and 3 older children represented significant wealth. Yet this youngest child appeared malnourished and neglected. Daniel set down the magnifying glass and rubbed his eyes. As a historian, he had studied the harsh realities of the 19th century: child labor, high mortality rates, poverty, and inequality. But this was different. This was a wealthy family, clearly capable of providing for all their children, Yet one child had been singled out for neglect. He turned back to the trunk and began searching through other photographs, looking for more images of the Worthington family. He found several: a portrait from 1895 showing the parents with only the 3 older children. Another from 1897, similar composition. Then the 1898 Christmas portrait with all 5 family members. The youngest girl appeared in no photographs before 1898. She simply materialized in the family portrait that year, as if she had always been there, though clearly she had not. Daniel opened his notebook and began making notes. Youngest child appears suddenly in 1898 family portrait, approximately 5 to 6 years old. Shows signs of severe neglect, malnutrition, inadequate clothing, not present in earlier family photographs. Question: who is this child? Where did she come from? Why is she being treated so differently from the other children? He knew his next step would be to search through city records, birth certificates, census data, newspaper archives. Somewhere in Boston's bureaucratic history, there would be answers about this forgotten child who had been captured on film but seemingly erased from the family story. As midnight approached, Daniel made one more discovery in the trunk. Tucked into an envelope were household account books from the Worthington estate, meticulously recording every expense from 1895 to 1902. He opened the ledger for 1898 and began reading through the entries: coal, food, servants' wages, clothing, medical expenses. On March 15, 1898, there was a single entry that made his blood run cold. Adoption fee, St. Catherine's Orphanage, $50. The next morning, Daniel called his supervisor at the Boston Historical Society and requested a week of research leave. He had become obsessed with the image of that small, neglected child, and he needed answers. St. Catherine's Orphanage no longer existed. The building had been demolished in 1935, and the Catholic diocese had absorbed its records into the archdiocesan archives. Daniel spent Monday morning navigating the bureaucracy of the archdiocese, explaining his research project to 3 different clerks before finally being granted limited access to historical adoption records. The archives occupied a climate-controlled basement beneath the Chancery building. A young archivist named Father Michael led Daniel to a section of shelving containing leather-bound ledgers from various closed institutions. St. Catherine's operated from 1867 to 1935, Father Michael explained, pulling down several volumes. They primarily served Irish Catholic orphans and children of unwed mothers. Adoption records from before 1920 are complicated. The practices weren't always ethical by modern standards. Daniel understood the careful phrasing. The late 19th century had seen numerous scandals involving orphanages, adoption mills, and the exploitation of poor children by wealthy families seeking cheap domestic labor. He opened the ledger for 1898 and began searching through entries recorded in neat, precise handwriting. Each page documented children entering and leaving the institution: names, ages, dates of arrival, circumstances of placement. Most entries were heartbreaking. Mother died in childbirth, father unknown. Parents deceased, typhoid fever. Abandoned on church steps, approximately 2 years old. He found it on page 67. Margaret Flynn, age 5 years, admitted January 3, 1898. Mother, Bridget Flynn, deceased December 30, 1897, tuberculosis. Father, unknown. Child in good health but underweight. Placed with the Worthington family, Beacon Hill, March 15, 1898, as ward and domestic helper. Adoption fee paid in full. Domestic helper. Daniel felt sick. The child in the photograph, Margaret Flynn, had been taken from the orphanage not as a daughter but as a servant, at 5 years old. Is something wrong? Father Michael asked, noticing Daniel's expression. This entry, Daniel said, pointing to Margaret's record. It says she was placed as a domestic helper. What does that mean exactly? Father Michael's face grew somber. It was a common practice, unfortunately. Wealthy families would pay the orphanage a fee and take a child, ostensibly adopting them. But in reality, the children were used as unpaid servants, caring for younger children, cleaning, running errands. They were given food and shelter but little else, No education, no affection, no real family membership. It was exploitation disguised as charity. Was it legal? Technically, yes. There were few regulations governing adoption. The orphanage received money to support other children. The wealthy family got cheap labor. And the child, he paused, the child had a roof over their head, which was considered better than the alternative. Daniel copied Margaret's information into his notebook, his hand shaking with anger. Are there any other records? Anything showing what happened to these children after placement? Sometimes. Let me check the supplementary files. Father Michael disappeared into the stacks and returned 15 minutes later with a slim folder. This contains correspondence between St. Catherine's and various families regarding placed children. There might be something about the Worthingtons. Daniel opened the folder and found 3 letters, all dated 1899, written in an elegant hand on expensive stationery bearing the Worthington family crest. Daniel's hands trembled as he unfolded the first letter, dated March 1899, exactly 1 year after Margaret Flynn had been placed with the Worthington family. Dear Sister Mary Agnes, I write regarding the girl Margaret whom we took into our household last year. While she performs her duties adequately, she has proven sullen and ungrateful. She does not smile or show proper appreciation for the Christian charity we have extended to her. My older children have complained that she frightens them with her constant silence and strange behaviors. Moreover, she has twice attempted to take food from the pantry without permission, suggesting a dishonest character that requires correction. I have been forced to limit her meals to ensure she learns proper discipline and gratitude. Perhaps the sisters did not adequately prepare her for life in a decent household. I trust you will pray for her reformation. Sincerely, Mrs. Catherine Worthington. Daniel set the letter down, feeling rage building in his chest. The woman described starving a 6-year-old child as discipline and blamed the orphanage for the girl's ingratitude. The second letter, dated 6 months later, was worse. Dear Sister Mary Agnes, Margaret's behavior has not improved despite my firm guidance. She continues to be willful and has caused disruption in our household. Last week, she spoke back to me when I corrected her work, showing a defiant spirit most unsuitable for a child of her unfortunate origins. Additionally, she has been caught speaking with our cook, Mrs. O'Brien, in what I can only describe as conspiracy. I have dismissed Mrs. O'Brien for encouraging the girl's inappropriate behavior. Margaret must learn her place and be grateful for the opportunity we have given her. I request that you send documentation confirming our legal guardianship is permanent and irrevocable. My husband insists on this formality for household management purposes. Sincerely, Mrs. Catherine Worthington. The third letter was brief, dated December 1899. Dear Sister Mary Agnes, thank you for providing the requested documentation. Margaret will remain with our family permanently. She is learning to be more obedient, though progress is slow. I assure you she receives adequate care and Christian instruction. Sincerely, Mrs. Catherine Worthington. Daniel looked up at Father Michael, who had been reading over his shoulder. There's no response from the orphanage in this file. No, Father Michael said quietly. Once the placement was formalized and the fee paid, St. Catherine's typically didn't follow up. The assumption was that a wealthy family would provide better care than an institution. Obviously, that wasn't always true. What recourse did these children have? Could they leave? Report abuse? Where would they go? Who would believe them over a respected family? And legally, once the adoption papers were signed, they belonged to that family. It was essentially indentured servitude, but perfectly legal. Daniel stood abruptly, needing to move, to do something with the fury coursing through him. I need to find out what happened to Margaret Flynn. Did she survive in that house? Did she escape? There has to be more information somewhere. Father Michael nodded. Try the city census records. If she was still living with the Worthingtons in 1900, she'd be listed. And if she wasn't... He trailed off, the implication clear. Daniel gathered his notes and the copies Father Michael had made of the letters. As he left the archives, he couldn't stop thinking about that photograph. Margaret sitting at her adoptive mother's feet, thin and silent and alone, while the family that exploited her smiled for the camera. The Massachusetts State Archives occupied a modern building in Dorchester. its climate-controlled reading room a stark contrast to the dusty parish archives Daniel had visited the day before. He requested the 1900 federal census records for Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood and settled in for what he knew would be hours of careful searching. Census records from 1900 were handwritten, often difficult to read, with creative spellings of names and occasional errors. Each page listed households with every occupant, family members, servants, boarders, along with their ages, occupations, and relationships to the head of household. Daniel found the Worthington household on page 32 of Enumeration District 14. Charles Worthington, head, age 45, shipping merchant Catherine Worthington, wife, age 42, Charles Worthington Jr., son, age 14, Henry Worthington, son, age 12, Elizabeth Worthington, daughter, age 10, Mary Sullivan, servant, age 35, cook Thomas Burke, servant, age 28, coachman Margaret Flynn, ward, age 7, domestic servant. There she was, listed not as a daughter, but as a ward and domestic servant. At 7 years old, the census officially recorded her as working for the family that had claimed to adopt her. Daniel's stomach churned. Seeing it documented in official government records made it even more horrifying. This exploitation was so normalized that a census taker had written it down without apparent concern, and no one had questioned it. He continued searching through census records for subsequent years. The 1910 census showed Charles Worthington, age 55, Catherine Worthington, age 52, Elizabeth Worthington, daughter, age 20, unmarried Margaret Flynn, ward, age 17, domestic servant still there, still listed as a servant. Margaret would have been 17 in 1910, old enough to leave, yet apparently still trapped in the Worthington household. Daniel wondered what kept her there. Fear, lack of options, legal constraints. The 1920 census brought a significant change. Charles Worthington, age 65, retired Catherine Worthington, age 62, no Margaret Flynn, no Elizabeth Worthington. The household listed only the elderly couple and one servant. Daniel sat back, processing this information. Margaret had disappeared from the Worthington household sometime between 1910 and 1920. But where had she gone? Had she finally escaped? Married? Died? He turned to Boston city directories, which listed residents alphabetically by surname along with their addresses and occupations. He searched through volumes from 1911 to 1920, looking for any Margaret Flynn that might be his Margaret. In the 1912 directory, he found Flynn Margaret, seamstress, 47 Union Street. Union Street was in the North End, a working-class neighborhood primarily inhabited by Italian and Irish immigrants. Daniel felt a surge of hope. Could this be her? A woman in her early 20s, working as a seamstress, living independently? He needed more confirmation. Death records, marriage records, anything that would definitively connect this Margaret Flynn to the girl in the photograph. As he gathered his materials to leave the archives, one of the research librarians approached him. "Excuse me, I couldn't help noticing you're researching the Worthington family," she said. "Are you familiar with the Historical Society's newspaper archive? There was quite a scandal involving that family around 1911 or 1912. It might be relevant to your research." Daniel's pulse quickened. "What kind of scandal?" "I don't remember the details, but it involved a lawsuit. Something about a former servant. The newspapers covered it extensively because the Worthingtons were such a prominent family." The Boston Public Library's microfilm collection occupied an entire floor, with dozens of machines for viewing newspapers dating back to the 1700s. Daniel requested reels for the Boston Globe and Boston Herald from 1911 and 1912, and began the tedious process of scrolling through page after page of headlines, advertisements, and society news. He found the first mention in the Globe from February 1912. Former ward sues prominent family claims. Years of exploitation and abuse. Margaret Flynn, age 19, has filed suit against Charles and Catherine Worthington of Beacon Hill, claiming she was forced into domestic servitude for 14 years under the guise of adoption. Miss Flynn alleges she received no education, no wages, and was subjected to physical punishment and deliberate starvation. The Worthingtons, who are well known in Boston society, have denied all allegations, stating that Miss Flynn was provided with a Christian home and every opportunity for advancement, which she squandered through laziness and ingratitude. Daniel's hands clenched around the edge of the microfilm reader. The language was cautious. Newspapers in 1912 had to be careful about libel when reporting on wealthy families. But the implications were clear. Margaret had escaped and was fighting back. He continued scrolling, finding multiple articles over the following months. March 1912. Worthington trial begins. Courtroom packed with spectators. The trial of Margaret Flynn versus Charles and Catherine Worthington commenced today in Suffolk County Superior Court. Miss Flynn appeared without legal representation, stating she could not afford an attorney. Judge Harrison Blackwell warned that her case would be difficult to prove without substantial evidence. April 1912. Shocking testimony in Worthington case. Miss Flynn testified for 3 hours yesterday, describing years of abuse in the Worthington household. She stated she was forced to work from dawn until midnight, received insufficient food, was beaten for minor infractions, and was denied any education or contact with the outside world. She claimed she was treated worse than the paid servants, who at least received wages and days off. The Worthington's attorney, Mr. Edmund Pierce, suggested that Miss Flynn was motivated by greed and resentment, attempting to extract money from a family that had rescued her from an orphanage. May 1912. Former servants testify in Flynn case. In a dramatic turn, 3 former Worthington household servants provided testimony supporting Miss Flynn's claims. Mrs. Ellen O'Brien, who served as cook from 1897 to 1899, stated she was dismissed for showing kindness to young Margaret and attempting to give her extra food. She described seeing the child punished by being locked in a cellar storage room for hours. Mr. Thomas Burke, former coachman, testified that he witnessed Mrs. Worthington strike Margaret with a wooden spoon hard enough to leave bruises. Miss Sarah Collins, a former housemaid, stated that Margaret slept in an unheated attic room and wore the same threadbare dress for years, while the Worthington children received new clothing regularly. Daniel felt tears prickling his eyes as he read the testimony. These people had witnessed Margaret's suffering and done what they could within the constraints of their positions. Mrs. O'Brien had been fired for her compassion. The others had apparently left the household on their own, unable to continue witnessing the abuse. The final article appeared in June 1912. Worthington case dismissed. Judge cites lack of legal standing. Judge Blackwell dismissed Margaret Flynn's lawsuit yesterday, ruling that she had no legal standing to sue her former guardians. The judge stated that while Miss Flynn's testimony was troubling, adoption laws of the period provided parents with wide latitude in discipline and household management. He noted that Miss Flynn had been provided with food, shelter, and religious instruction, which fulfilled the basic requirements of guardianship. This court cannot intervene in family matters based solely on allegations of harsh treatment, Judge Blackwell stated. Miss Flynn was removed from an orphanage and given a home. That she found the conditions unpleasant does not constitute grounds for legal action. The Worthingtons declined to comment beyond a brief statement, expressing satisfaction with the verdict and disappointment that their Christian charity had been so ungratefully repaid. Daniel sat back from the microfilm reader, fury and despair warring within him. Margaret had been brave enough to speak her truth in court, had found witnesses willing to risk their reputations to support her, and still the system had failed her. The judge had essentially ruled that exploitation of orphans by wealthy families was acceptable as long as basic survival needs were met. He printed copies of all the articles, adding them to his growing file on Margaret Flynn. But one question remained. What had happened to her after the trial? Had she survived, built a life for herself, or had the public humiliation and legal defeat broken her? Daniel spent the next 3 days searching through every record he could access. City directories, property records, marriage licenses, death certificates. The Margaret Flynn listed as a seamstress at 47 Union Street appeared in directories continuously from 1912 through 1945, always at the same address, always with the same occupation. On Thursday morning, he decided to visit Union Street itself. The neighborhood had changed dramatically since 1912. Many of the old tenement buildings had been replaced or renovated, but number 47 still stood, a narrow 3-story brick building with a bakery on the ground floor and apartments above. The bakery was owned by an elderly Italian man named Antonio, who had run the business for 40 years. When Daniel explained he was researching the building's history, Antonio's face lit up. "My father bought this building in 1945, Antonio said, wiping flour from his hands. "The woman who owned it before, she lived here her whole life. Miss Flynn, Margaret Flynn. Never married, never had children, just worked as a seamstress upstairs for, I don't know, must have been 30 years or more." Daniel's heart raced. "Your father knew her?" "Oh yes, very well. She taught my older sister to sew. Very kind woman, very quiet. She died in 1946, must have been 53 or 54 years old." Heart gave out, the doctor said. "My father said she worked too hard her whole life, never took care of herself." "Do you know anything else about her? Where she came from? Her family?" Antonio shook his head. "She never talked about her past. My father asked once, when he was buying the building, if she had any family who should inherit. She just said she was alone in the world, always had been, but she kept one thing. Come, I'll show you." He led Daniel up narrow stairs to the second floor, which had been converted into storage for the bakery. In one corner, covered with a dusty sheet, was an old wooden cabinet. "My father couldn't bring himself to throw this away," Antonio explained, pulling off the sheet. "It was hers, and it seemed disrespectful. We kept meaning to donate it somewhere, but—" He shrugged. The cabinet was simple but well made, with 3 drawers and a small door. Daniel opened the door carefully. Inside was a collection of items that took his breath away: photographs, newspaper clippings, and a small leather journal. "May I look through this?" Daniel asked, his voice barely steady. "Take what you need. Maybe you can tell her story properly. She deserves that." Daniel carefully removed the items and spread them on a nearby table. The photographs showed Margaret at various ages, a young woman of about 20 standing proudly in front of her shop with a "Margaret Flynn dressmaker" sign. Margaret at perhaps 30, surrounded by other women at what appeared to be a union meeting. Margaret in her 40s teaching young girls to sew. The newspaper clippings were all related to her trial. She had saved every article. And written in the margins, in a neat, careful hand, were her own annotations. Next to the headline about the trial being dismissed, "But I told the truth." Next to the judge's statement about Christian charity, "Charity does not include cruelty." Next to the Worthington's statement about ingratitude, "I owe them nothing but my voice." Daniel picked up the journal with trembling hands. The first entry was dated July 1912, just weeks after the trial. "Today I start again. They could not silence me in court, but they did not need to. The judge and the law did that for them. But I spoke my truth. 3 other people were brave enough to speak for me. That must count for something. I have rented this room with the small amount of money I saved from sewing work done secretly at night in the Worthington house. Mrs. Chen, who runs the laundry downstairs, has agreed to teach me proper dressmaking. I will build a life for myself. I will not be erased." Daniel sat in Antonio's storage room for hours, reading through Margaret's journal by the light of a single dusty window. The entries spanned from 1912 to 1945, a lifetime chronicled in Margaret's clear, educated handwriting. Educated, Daniel realized, because she had taught herself to read and write despite being denied schooling. August 1912. "Mrs. Chen says I have natural talent with a needle. I am taking in simple mending and alterations. The work is hard on my eyes in the lamplight, but it is mine. No one can take it from me." December 1912. "A woman came to my door today asking if I could make her daughter a dress for Christmas. When I showed her my samples, she hired me immediately. I earned $3, 3 whole dollars that belong only to me. I wanted to cry but smiled instead." March 1913. "I have saved enough to purchase a proper sewing machine. It is second-hand, but it works beautifully. I can complete work so much faster now. Mrs. Chen has begun sending customers to me, saying I do finer work than she can manage on her laundry equipment." The entries revealed a woman of remarkable strength and determination. Margaret had built a business from nothing, slowly establishing herself as a skilled seamstress. She sewed wedding dresses, christening gowns, mourning clothes, all the fabric milestones of life for the working families of the North End. November 1918. The influenza has taken so many. I have sewn 12 mourning dresses this month alone. Each one breaks my heart, especially the small ones for children. I remember being a child with no one to mourn me if I died. These children have families who loved them. That is something. June 1920. A young woman came to me today with bruises on her arms that she tried to hide. She needed alterations on a dress her employer gave her. She works as a housemaid for a family on Commonwealth Avenue. I recognized the fear in her eyes. I recognized myself. I gave her the alterations for free and told her my story. I told her she did not have to endure it, that there were people who would help her. She cried and said no one would believe her against her employers. I gave her my address and told her if she ever needed a place to stay, I would help her. She left quickly, ashamed of her tears. I pray she finds the courage I found. But I know how hard it is, how impossible it seems. Daniel wiped his eyes, moved by Margaret's compassion for a stranger who reminded her of her younger self. He continued reading, finding more entries about women she had helped over the years, other servants, other exploited workers, women fleeing abusive situations. September 1922. I have been thinking about the trial, about how the judge said I had no legal standing, that my testimony did not matter because I was only a ward, only a servant, only an orphan. But I matter. My voice matters. The voices of all the girls like me matter. We are not invisible, even when the world tries to make us so. I have begun attending meetings of the Women's Trade Union League. They are fighting for better conditions for working women. Perhaps together we can change things. Perhaps other children will not suffer as I did. The later entries showed Margaret's involvement in labor organizing and advocacy for child welfare reform. She had testified before the Massachusetts legislature in 1924 in support of stricter adoption regulations. She had helped establish a shelter for young women fleeing domestic service positions. She had given money to St. Catherine's Orphanage, the same institution that had placed her with the Worthingtons, specifically designated for education programs for orphaned girls. January 1930. I received a letter today from a young woman named Catherine. She was placed as a domestic servant with a family in Cambridge 3 years ago. She read about my trial in old newspaper archives at the library and wanted to thank me for speaking up. She said my story gave her courage to leave her situation. She has a job now in a factory. It is hard work, but she earns wages and has her own room in a boarding house. She is teaching herself to read better. She has hope. I never knew if my testimony mattered, if losing that trial meant I had failed. But Catherine's letter tells me I did not fail. My voice reached across 18 years to help someone else. That is enough. That is everything. The final entries were shorter, written by a woman whose health was clearly failing. March 1945. My heart troubles me more each day. The doctor says I must rest, but there are 3 wedding dresses to finish this month. These young brides deserve beautiful gowns as they start their lives. I will finish the work. December 1945. I have been thinking about my funeral arrangements. I have no family, but I have friends. Mrs. Chen's daughter has promised to handle everything. I have saved enough money for a simple burial. I do not want to be buried at Calvary Cemetery, where the Worthingtons have their grand monument. I will rest at Forest Hills, in the section for working people. That is where I belong. The final entry was dated January 3rd, 1946, Margaret's 53rd birthday. Today I am 53 years old. I have lived longer than I ever expected to when I was that starving child in the Worthington house. I have built a life they said I did not deserve. I have helped others. I have mattered. If anyone ever finds this journal, I hope they understand. I was not a victim. I was a survivor. And I never stopped fighting. Daniel closed the journal, his vision blurred with tears. He sat in silence for several minutes, processing everything he had learned about Margaret Flynn, the child in the photograph who had been exploited and abused, the young woman who had fought for justice in court and lost, the seamstress who had spent her life helping others and advocating for change. Antonio had returned and stood quietly in the doorway. "She was important, wasn't she?" he asked. "Yes," Daniel said, "more important than anyone knew." Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel worked frantically to document Margaret's story. He wrote to the Massachusetts State Archives, requesting that her trial testimony be digitized and preserved. He contacted the Women's Trade Union League, which still maintained records of Margaret's involvement in labor organizing. He visited Forest Hills Cemetery and found her grave, a simple stone with just her name and dates, purchased with her own carefully saved money. He also researched what had happened to the Worthington family. Charles Worthington had died in 1922, wealthy and respected. Catherine had died in 1928. Their obituaries praised their philanthropy and civic contributions, making no mention of the trial or Margaret's accusations. Their children had all married well and moved to other states. The family's mansion had been sold in 1925 and later demolished. Not a trace remained of the house where Margaret had suffered for 14 years. But Daniel had found something the Worthingtons could not erase. The photograph that had started his investigation, now understood in its full horrible context. The image of a prosperous family with their exploited servant, positioned as decoration at their feet, malnourished and silent while they smiled for posterity. He reached out to colleagues at other historical institutions, sharing Margaret's story and asking if they knew of similar cases. The responses were overwhelming. Dozens of historians wrote back with their own discoveries of exploited orphans, informal adoption arrangements that were actually servitude, and legal systems that had protected wealthy families at the expense of vulnerable children. Margaret's story was not unique. It was one example of a widespread practice that had harmed thousands of children across the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Daniel compiled everything he had learned into a comprehensive report, which he submitted to the Boston Historical Society, along with the photograph, Margaret's journal, the newspaper clippings, and copies of all the legal and census records he had uncovered. The Society's board reviewed his work and unanimously voted to create a special exhibition focused on child welfare history, with Margaret's story as the centerpiece. When Daniel visited Antonio's bakery to return the cabinet, he brought a copy of the photograph. "Would you like to have this?" he asked. "It's a copy of an image that shows what she endured. I thought you might want it since you preserved her memory." Antonio studied the photograph for a long moment, his eyes focusing on the small, thin girl at the bottom of the frame. "That's her? That child?" "Yes. Margaret Flynn at 6 years old, 2 years after being placed with the Worthington family."